In the autumn of 2007, Klaus Meine stood in a marble hallway inside Hampton Court Palace, straightening his jacket with hands that had not shaken like this before a stadium crowd of 80,000. He could hear faintly laughter and clinking glasses drifting from the reception hall beyond the doors, a hushed kind of luxury completely unlike the roar of any arena he had ever played. Somewhere beyond those doors waited a man who had once controlled enough nuclear warheads to end civilization, a man whose decision in 1991 had quietly closed the book on the Cold War. Klaus was about to meet Mikhail Gorbachev, not as a fan meeting an idol, not as a musician chasing a headline, as, almost impossibly, a friend. 18 years earlier, Klaus had written 4 minutes of music on a hotel balcony in Moscow, watching the Moskva River and wondering if the world he saw changing before his eyes was real or a dream that would collapse by morning. That song, Wind of Change, had gone on to become something no one in Scorpions could have predicted. An anthem hummed in the streets of a crumbling empire, a whistled melody that outlived the Soviet Union itself. And now, here he was, about to walk into a room and shake the hand of the very man whose choices had made that melody possible. What Klaus did not yet know, standing in that hallway with his pulse loud in his ears, was that this handshake would not end with a photograph and a polite exchange of thanks. It would be the start of a real friendship, one that would follow Scorpions for the rest of their career, tying 4 aging rockers from Hannover to global politics in a way no other rock band on earth had ever experienced. To understand why that handshake meant so much, you have to go back to August 1989, to Lenin Stadium in Moscow, where Scorpions had come to play the Moscow Music Peace Festival alongside Bon Jovi, Motley Crue, and Ozzy Osbourne. The Soviet Union was still, officially, a closed and controlled world. Western rock music had been treated for decades as a dangerous foreign infection, smuggled in on bootleg cassette tapes and played behind closed curtains. And yet there they stood, Klaus Meine and Rudolf Schenker, looking out over a sea of Soviet kids who had waited hours just to get near the gates. Young soldiers had been posted around the stadium that week to keep order. Instead, night after night, those same soldiers found themselves swaying, then singing, then climbing onto the barricades themselves, tears running down their faces as the music swelled. Klaus stood at the microphone and felt something he had never felt on any stage before. Not excitement, but disbelief. These young people were not supposed to feel this free, and yet here they were, feeling it anyway, in front of him, in the heart of the empire that had built the Berlin Wall. On one of the last nights, Klaus wandered out onto a hotel balcony overlooking the Moskva River. Ships passed slowly below him. Somewhere in the city, the old order was already cracking, though no one could yet say how far the cracks would spread. He watched the water, the lights, the strange calm of a country holding its breath, and a melody began forming in his head, quiet at first, almost like a question he was asking the sky. That melody became Wind of Change, and within 2 years it had outgrown the band that wrote it. Released in 1990, it spread across a continent that was tearing down walls in real time. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall itself had fallen, chunks of concrete carried away by hand as strangers embraced atop the rubble. By the time Scorpions' song hit radios across Europe, it did not sound like a rock ballad anymore. It sounded like a soundtrack someone had been secretly writing for history itself. People in East Germany, in Poland, in the crumbling Soviet republics, adopted it as their own, whistling the opening notes on street corners, in cafes, in taxis idling outside buildings that had once housed feared secret police. On Christmas Day, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev appeared on Soviet television and announced his resignation as president of a country that, by the next morning, would no longer exist. The red flag over the Kremlin came down for the last time that evening. And in apartments across a dissolving empire, in bars in West Berlin, in dorm rooms from Prague to Vienna, that same haunting, whistled melody was playing on the radio, as if the entire world had agreed, without ever discussing it, that this song belonged to that exact moment in history. For Scorpions, the years that followed were strange, in a way that no other rock band has ever quite had to navigate. They were still, at heart, four guys from Hannover who loved loud guitars and packed arenas. But now, in every interview, journalists wanted to talk less about music and more about geopolitics. Reporters asked Klaus what it felt like to have accidentally written the anthem of the end of the Cold War. Historians cited the song in books about 1989. Diplomats mentioned it in speeches. It was an extraordinary kind of fame, but also an isolating one, because no other musicians on earth had lived through anything quite like it. Klaus later admitted there were nights he wondered whether Wind of Change had become bigger than the band itself, whether Scorpions would forever be introduced as the group behind that one song, rather than as the touring, recording, evolving band they actually were. And there was a quieter question, too, one that lingered for years without an answer. Somewhere in Moscow, did the man at the very center of that historic collapse, the Soviet leader who had allowed the walls to fall without ordering tanks into the streets, know that a German rock song existed with his fingerprints all over it? For years, nobody could say for certain. The two worlds, rock stadiums and Kremlin corridors, seemed too far apart to ever actually meet. Then, in 1999, tragedy struck the Gorbachev family. Raisa Gorbachev, Mikhail's wife of 46 years, the elegant, sharp-eyed woman who had stood beside him through the entire Soviet collapse, died of leukemia in a German hospital, with Mikhail at her bedside almost every day of her final weeks. Friends of the family said he read to her, held her hand through nights when the medicine offered little comfort, and rarely left the hospital corridor outside her room. Those close to him said he was never quite the same afterward, that the man who had faced down the entire Soviet Politburo seemed, for the first time, genuinely broken. Out of that grief came a decision. In 2006, Gorbachev and his daughter Irina founded the Raisa Gorbachev Foundation, dedicated to fighting childhood leukemia in Russia, the very disease that had taken Raisa from him. And in September 2007, the foundation staged an extraordinary fundraising gala at Hampton Court Palace outside London, a night designed to pull together musicians, actors, and business leaders from across the world to raise money for sick children thousands of miles away. Someone on the organizing committee remembered a detail that, on paper, seemed almost too poetic to be true. There was a song, still played on the radio nearly 2 decades later, that had become inseparable from Gorbachev's own legacy. Its writer was still touring. An invitation was sent to Scorpions. That is how Klaus Meine came to be standing in that marble hallway, waiting to meet the man behind the melody he had written on a hotel balcony in Moscow. When the doors finally opened, Gorbachev crossed the room, moving slower than the newsreels of his younger self, but with the same steady, appraising eyes. The room around them had gone quiet, waiters pausing mid-step, other guests instinctively stepping back to give the two men space. Through an interpreter, he took Klaus's hand and held it a moment longer than protocol required. He told him simply that he knew the song, that he had heard it many times over the years, and that it had come to mean something personal to him, not as a politician, but as a man who had lived through everything it described. He spoke, briefly and without bitterness, about the winter of 1991, about handing over power without a single shot fired, about believing that some doors, once opened, should never be closed again. He paused, his eyes drifting briefly toward the window, as though that winter was still visible somewhere beyond the palace grounds. Then, almost gently, he mentioned Raisa. He said that music like this, honest and unguarded, was exactly the kind of thing she would have loved. Klaus stood there, a rock singer who had performed for hundreds of thousands of screaming fans, utterly unable to find his voice. It was not admiration Klaus felt in that moment. It was recognition, the strange and rare sense of meeting someone who had lived on the opposite side of the exact same turning point in history. What began that night at Hampton Court did not fade into a polite memory the way celebrity encounters so often do. It grew into something real. Over the following years, Gorbachev and members of Scorpions crossed paths again and again, at charity events, at anniversaries, at private gatherings arranged specifically so the two sides could talk without cameras. Rudolf Schenker later described sitting across from Gorbachev and being struck by his humor, sharp and self-deprecating, utterly unlike the stern Soviet image many Western fans still carried in their heads. Gorbachev, for his part, began speaking about the band publicly with genuine warmth, crediting their music, and Wind of Change specifically, as one of the cultural forces that had helped ordinary people across the Iron Curtain believe change was actually possible before it arrived. For a band that had spent years wondering if they were merely footnotes in someone else's history, it was a profound kind of validation, delivered by the one man on earth whose opinion on the subject carried more weight than any music critic alive. 2 years later, in November 2009, that unlikely bond found its most public stage yet. Berlin marked the 20th anniversary of the fall of the wall with a night of ceremony along the very line where the barrier had once stood, giant foam dominoes arranged to topple one by one in front of the Brandenburg Gate, watched by heads of state and hundreds of thousands of ordinary Berliners. Klaus Meine stood near that stage once again, and so, among the honored guests, did Mikhail Gorbachev, the man whose choices 2 decades earlier had made the whole spectacle possible. It was an odd sensation for Klaus, watching those dominoes fall in careful, rehearsed silence, remembering how differently the real collapse had felt, chaotic, loud, and utterly unplanned. Afterward, in a quiet moment away from the cameras, Gorbachev found him again, and the two spoke not as icon and admirer, but as two men who had each, in their own way, watched history bend around them. For Klaus, it confirmed something he had begun to suspect since that first handshake at Hampton Court. This was not a friendship built for press photographs. Gorbachev asked about the band's upcoming tours, about Rudolf's health, about ordinary things old friends ask each other, even when no journalists were watching. It was, Klaus later said, one of the strangest gifts of his entire career, being trusted not for what Wind of Change had done for history, but simply for who he was underneath it. But the friendship carried a cost as well as an honor. From that point forward, Scorpions could never again simply be a rock band promoting a new album. Every tour brought questions about Gorbachev's health, about Russian politics, about whether the band still believed the optimism of 1989 had been justified, especially as the years wore on and relations between Russia and the West grew colder again. Klaus found himself, again and again, having to explain a friendship that was deeply personal, in terms that satisfied journalists looking for a political headline. Fans sometimes wrote to the band uncertain whether they were still, first and foremost, a rock and roll act, or had become something closer to unofficial cultural diplomats, a question Klaus never fully answered because he was not entirely sure himself. He always insisted the bond was human first, built on mutual respect between two men who had each, in their own very different ways, tried to bring people together rather than divide them. Rudolph echoed that sentiment, saying that whatever the shifting winds of international politics, their friendship with Gorbachev himself had never wavered. It was not about the Kremlin or the Cold War anymore, he said. It was about a man who had shown Klaus more warmth than most people show their oldest friends. Then came August 2022. Mikhail Gorbachev died at the age of 91 after a long illness in a Moscow hospital. The news broke quickly around the world, obituaries measuring his legacy in falling walls and ended empires. But for Klaus Meine and Rudolf Schenker, the news landed somewhere far more personal. They had lost, not a historical figure they had once been photographed beside, but a genuine friend, one who had held Klaus's hand in a palace hallway and spoken to him about his late wife with unguarded honesty. Scorpions issued a heartfelt tribute in the days that followed, remembering not the politician, but the man, his humor, his warmth, the quiet dignity with which he had let go of absolute power rather than cling to it at any cost. On tour that autumn, Klaus began introducing Wind of Change differently, dedicating it, some nights, directly to Gorbachev's memory, his voice catching slightly on lines he had sung thousands of times before. Nearly 2 decades after that first handshake at Hampton Court, the friendship between 4 rockers from Hanover and the last leader of the Soviet Union remains one of the strangest and most moving chapters in rock history. A reminder that the biggest walls, political or personal, sometimes fall because of the smallest, most human connections. A chord progression written on a hotel balcony. A hand held a moment too long in a marble hallway. And 2 men, from utterly different worlds, discovering they had been telling the same story all along. For the generation who lived through 1989 and remembers exactly where they were the night the wall came down, that story is not just rock history. It is their own history, set to music.